The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Take a look at what happened.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump survives an assassination attempt at a Pennsylvania rally, just days ahead of his formal nomination as the GOP's presidential candidate at the Republican National Convention. President Biden addresses the nation from the Oval Office, asking Americans to take stock whilst calling for unity.
There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever. Period. No exception. We can't allow this violence to be normalized. You know, the political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down.
Chinese economic growth misses expectations in the second quarter, slowing to 4.7% amid persistent weakness in consumer demand. And Alphabet is reportedly in advanced talks to buy cybersecurity startup Wiz for around $23 billion in what would be the tech giant's largest ever acquisition.
The former U.S. president and presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump has landed in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention. This as America looks to see what implications the assassination attempt that left him injured and a rally attendee dead could have on the country's political landscape. Trump says he was shot in the ear in Saturday's shooting. Trump also adds he has rewritten his convention speech to focus on unity, telling the Washington Examiner the event is a chance to bring the country together. That address is expected Thursday. Our colleague Joe Kernan actually spoke to Mr. Trump on Sunday evening, saying the former president is, quote, doing great and is gratified by all the encouragement and support from both sides of the aisle.
President Biden gave an Oval Office address on Sunday, calling on Americans to lower the temperature on political rhetoric in what has already been a fractious campaign.
Disagreement is inevitable in American democracy. It's part of human nature. But politics must never be a literal battlefield, or God forbid, a killing field. I believe politics ought to be an arena for peaceful debate, to pursue justice, to make decisions guided by the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. We stand for an America, not of extremism and fury, but of decency and grace. All of us now face the time of testing as the election approaches. And the higher the stakes, the more fervent the passions become. This places an added burden on each of us to ensure that no matter how strong our convictions, we must never descend into violence. The Republican convention will start tomorrow. I have no doubt they'll criticize my record and offer their own vision for this country. I'll be traveling this week making the case for our record and the vision, my vision of the country, our vision. I'll continue to speak out strongly for our democracy, stand up for our Constitution and the rule of law, to call for action at the ballot box, no violence on our streets. That's how democracy should work.
Biden's team pulled television ads and other political communications in the wake of Sunday's shooting, but says it will resume drawing the contrast between him and Trump after Biden's interview tonight on NBC News. Meanwhile, the FBI says it is investigating the attack as a possible act of domestic terrorism after a number of suspicious devices were found in the home and car of shooter Thomas Matthew Crooks. The Secret Service is coming under increasing scrutiny after Saturday's attack. Sources familiar with the agency's operations have told NBC News the rooftop Crooks shot from was identified as a security vulnerability before the rally took place. The House and Senate Homeland Security Committees say they will investigate Saturday's assassination attempt. Let's get to Peter Triburitz, who is the Director of US Centre at LSE. Peter, let's just start broad. The extraordinary events after the weekend. Just give us your reaction to what we've seen.
Well, I mean, among other things, it just reminds us that the country is at a moment, Karen, where there's just so much talk of political violence. It never seems very far from the surface. I mean, the reaction to this as well immediately on social media was so incredibly polarizing, conspiratorial. I mean, cooler heads perhaps are prevailing right now. We heard Biden last night and the day of the shooting, and Trump as well is sending out a signal that he's going to take a higher road or a higher path at the convention, talking more about unity and less about division. I suppose we'll have to wait and see. But it is, as you said at the outset, it's incredibly fraught, the politics in the United States. Most Americans reject political violence as an answer or as a solution. But there was a study just last May showing that over 20% of Americans think that there's a place for it. And that's just an incredible number when you stop and you think about it.
There were calls across the aisle really to dial down the rhetoric over the weekend after what we've seen transpire. When it comes to Trump, can I just start there? Because what we saw, an initial reaction, fist pump on the back of the attack, and then the communication down the track suggesting that this is a moment of unity for the nation. The tone that Trump takes from here, how significant will that be?
I think it's very significant. And I think the same is true for Biden. I mean, you know, there was something over 8,000 threats against public officials last year in the United States. Many of them are not serious, but there are plenty that are. And the tone that is set by the top political leaders, I think, is just so essential to changing the atmosphere. So, I mean, I think it's important. We don't know what the motivation of the shooter was, but if you have this kind of stark rhetoric where everybody's an enemy, or the opposing party is an enemy, and violence is okay, and metaphors are used about bullseyes and crosshairs, and and winking at or laughing off violence that occurs against an individual. Against certain against politicians on the other side, it just fuels it. I mean, I think this is why, the January 6th, 2021 uprising, 2021 uprising was so dangerous. It really set a terrible precedent. And this latest episode is likely only to encourage others,
Peter,
unless the rhetoric is toned down.
Peter, it's great to hear your thoughts, but let's be brutally honest about it. It's not just the Republicans who are at fault here in the rhetoric. The Democrats, and I've found on Democrats.org, remember, Donald Trump, dictator on day one. Trump is an existential threat to our democracy, etc., etc. You can find it all over lots of Democrat websites as well. The fact of the matter is, haven't the Democrats as well as the Republicans, and I take on board the full magnitude of your comments referring to January 6th, the fact of the matter is both sides have been very, very dangerous in typifying and portraying the other sides. And the Democrats now not only have their fair share of the blame to be apportioned to them as well, but their strategy for re-election of the president is in tatters. It was designed around this democracy threat that Donald Trump plays. The Biden administration has got a lot to answer for, and actually their re-election strategy is just looking awful, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I suppose we should back up here. I did invoke the metaphor of the bullseye, and unfortunately, Biden himself used that last week. And, that certainly was not helpful. I think most of this is actually, I don't think it's as symmetric as you're suggesting, but there's certainly terrible rhetoric on the extremes on both sides. So I don't discount that. On the left, as well as the right. I think it's principally, the problem is that it is principally, it's been fueled at the level of top leadership. I think it's principally come more from the right. But I think we're just at a point right now where on both sides, leaders, whether they're Democrats or the Republicans, really need to cool the rhetoric. In the Biden's case, I think Biden's in a difficult position here. It's hard to see how any of this helps Biden beyond perhaps pushing questions about his age and fitness. off the front page for a while. But for the next couple of weeks, and I think this is what we heard last night from him, his main job is going to be to try to move things to a higher plane, rejecting political violence. He's got to wear the president's cap here, hat, and that needs to be the position he takes. I mean, I think the real question here is whether Trump and the Republicans meet him halfway at the convention. The message coming out of from Trump's camp is that, in fact, he's going to do that he is going to adopt a more unifying message. I mean, that will be a change, and I think that will be an important change if it does occur.
We've got you, Peter. The Democrats, including the likes of George Clooney, beginning to turn on each other, turn on the president as well. This is a shambles, isn't it? Let's be brutally honest about it. Many of the Democrats knew exactly what's been going on with the president, whether he's had cognitive decline or not, whether he is suitable to be re-elected. They've had concerns for years. Why have they left it to the last possible moment and the debacle in that debate?
It's a great question, and of course there were voices calling for Biden to step away, to make good on his original pledge to only be a one-term president, to be a transition leader inside the Democratic Party, and to step away after the 22 election. And I think it's difficult to understand where the donors were. These same donors like Clooney that are taking that position now said they knew that when they met with him, several weeks before, that there was an issue. I think at the end of the day, it's very difficult to see how the Democratic Party is going to move away, or how it's hard for me to see how Biden steps down at this point. It's perhaps this event kind of scrambles things and opens up the political space for him to do so, but I think it's extremely unlikely. And and I think that as we move forward, the Democrats are probably going to just move in line with him.
Peter, if we talk about more of what happens from here, we've got the Republican National Convention kicking off in Milwaukee. Yeah. We've got Biden resuming the campaign trail again in Las Vegas on Tuesday, pulling his event in Texas today. But already the reaction, we've had the billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk throw support behind Trump, Bill Ackman, the hedge fund manager as well. But we've had sympathy coming through from Silicon Valley. What do we see here in terms of expectations now on the likely outcome for the presidential election? How should the markets be thinking about whether this has been priced in accurately at this stage, or whether there's still going to be a lot of moving pieces between now and November?
I mean, I think there'll still be movement. I don't think this shooting will fundamentally change most voters' views of the candidates. I mean, I think most voters, most Americans have set views about Donald Trump, either strongly for or strongly against. I think if you're looking for an exception in terms of a class or a group of voters, it's probably the so-called double haters who dislike both Trump and Biden, and they might have more sympathy for Trump in the wake of the attack. But if I had to place a bet, I don't think this event, as damaging as I think it is to American democracy, will change the trajectory of the presidential race. I mean, I think we are still looking, whether it's Biden or a Democrat that replaces him, we're looking at a close election. I mean, I think Donald Trump has a low ceiling and the Democrats have a pretty high floor. That's where we are in American politics right now. And I don't think this is going to fundamentally change that.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us for analysis. Peter Truberitz with us, Director, US Centre at the LSE. Going to take you for a look at some of the big safe haven players on markets at this stage. We are seeing a firmer dollar play out. If you look at dollar-yen rates, don't forget thin trading with Japan on a holiday. Also some caution around talk of intervention recently. So we're just trading off the 158 mark as dollar marches slightly into the green versus the currency. Elsewhere on the dollar index, up about 0.1%, 104 plus the level we're trading at. In terms of the US, we are seeing this reaction as to whether there could be a greater chance of a Trump presidency and what that means in terms of market reaction on treasuries and whether any re-election could come with greater spending measures, which would push up those yields. So at this stage, we've been seeing some strength in that yield stateside. The gold price, it's jumping around a little bit. 2411 is what we're seeing on the market action today. In focus still a lot of the attention on monetary policy and just what direction we're heading in, given slightly tamer CPI numbers lately. So the market, I think, still trying to ascertain that direction around monetary policy in the mix with the geopolitics. I want to take you to the cryptocurrency trade. We're back through $60,000 on Bitcoin prices. So that is something that the market's been watching. Alternative assets sometimes coming into play in events like this. So the crypto market, of course, one to watch with 62,751 in the trade, 4.6% higher, and across the space in the other major cryptocurrencies too. To US futures, we come off the back of what was a stronger session Friday. These major markets at fresh all-time highs intraday. And banking gains for the trading week, up 1.6% on the Dow. Worth noting just how strong the banks were last week. We saw index for banking stocks rallying about 7% A trickle of earnings starting to flow out from those banks in terms of their reports. But at this stage, we are called high. The market is still expected to bounce as it begins the trading session today. Steve.
Thanks very much indeed, Karen. We've just had some atrocious numbers out from one of the world's largest luxury groups, once again blaming China. So we'll discuss that after the break, where in China we have had slower than expected second quarter growth. Renewing calls for fresh stimulus from Beijing. Sam's going to join us with the latest on the health of the world's second largest economy after the break. Plus, it was a mixed bag, as Karen was saying, for the US banks on Friday. Earnings season getting underway once again stateside. We'll bring you the numbers later in the show. And we'll continue, of course, our breaking news coverage of the assassination attempt on the former President Donald Trump with Rob Casey, partner at Signum Global Advisors. That's coming up at 800 Central European Time.
Listen to CNBC's Beyond the Valley, the podcast that explores the biggest tech news from across the globe. Join me, Arjun Karpal.
And me, Tom Chitty, every week as we bring you insights into the top stories, unpack the latest trends, and find out where the industry is headed.
Now available on Spotify, Apple Music, and Google Podcasts.
A look at how we are setting up on European markets. We were just seeing the futures to break around the American market set higher, but we are called lower this morning according to opening calls. A give back of some of the stronger trade we saw last week as we were in lockstep with those US markets. But still, a lot in the backdrop around the domestic politics now in the United States, as well as the geopolitics internationally, and monetary policy still front and center. There is an ECB meeting this week, so the market's also eyeing that. To the Asian markets, where we're getting signals around the economy, and this from the Chinese market. It's been disappointing today. You can see Japanese stocks not trading. They're out of action. Hong Kong down 1.3%. Gains elsewhere, though. Australia up 0.6%. To the Chinese yuan, we are closely eyeing some of those cues we're getting from the economic front, but also when it comes to what we're seeing on the political side. Don't forget there's a once-in-a-5-year meeting that is taking place this week. So far, dollar is trading firmer versus the Chinese currency, Steve.
Yeah, just going to do these swatch numbers very briefly. A more than 14% drop in sales at current exchange rates in the first half. The luxury retailer said the decline was driven by a sharp drop in demand for luxury goods in Greater China, saying it expects that market to remain challenging until the end of the year. So zip recovery coming from Swatch in the foreseeable future. Of course, huge brands out there, including Omega as one of their biggest brands, Breguet, and Blancpain, one of the big luxury brands as well. The shares have fallen dramatically since their highs of the spring last year. China's economy grew less than expected in the second quarter as property woes and job insecurity weighed on domestic demand. GDP grew 4.7%, well down on the previous 3 months, and boosting expectations of more stimulus from Beijing. But Sam, we've had stimulus. We've had a lot of stimulus announcements, either with the PBOC or indeed from the government as well. And nothing yet seems to have moved the needle on the demand side of the equation and the difficulties that are still coming out of the property market. Lovely to see you, by the way.
Very good morning to you, Steve. Absolutely. It's just not enough. I think that's what the data is telling us today. If we look at the trend, what these numbers have told us is that we're continuing to see an encouraging picture on the supply side, not so much on the demand side. We thought that perhaps there was some rebalancing going on last month with a bit of a pickup in the retail sales, but we were once again back to missing expectations on the consumption front, 2% for that headline number. And one economist who was sitting in the studio earlier this morning from Oxford Economics just said that's dire. This is despite the fact that we still had a long weekend, the Dragon Boat Festival in June, and we also had the 618 Shopping Festival. So really something has got to come to help out the Chinese consumer right now. As I mentioned, encouraging on the supply side with the industrial output, that very much is consistent with the strong export showing that we've seen. The big question now is just how sustainable that is going to be moving ahead, because the narrative that seems to be out there is that we are seeing some front loading. And even the Chinese policymakers today said that there is external uncertainty, and that very much speaks to their feeling that maybe this situation is a bit vulnerable right now, because if we do see a pullback in global demand, what does China have to fall back on right now if the economic situation with sluggish domestic demand continues to show? We've seen that not just in the retail sales. Look at the new home prices that we got today. They continue to fall, and the property sector just goes to show it's still struggling to find a bottom despite the number of stimulus measures we've seen thrown at that sector. So we had new home prices falling at the fastest pace in 9 years. So that sector is still struggling. We had credit data out of the PBOC just a few days ago, and that is showing that the new bank lending is also missed the mark in terms of the expectations. Yes, household, mostly mortgage loans were up, so were corporate loans, but not as much as the market had been expecting. And so we did get, as you say, a 4.7% read on the Q2 GDP, not as much as the market was expecting. Most analysts were penciling in for 5, just above that or so. And so even the policymakers have acknowledged that, around 5% GDP for the first half of the year was hard won. So an economist has certainly said to us this morning that if it continues to go on this trajectory, they're going to undershoot that around 5% GDP growth target. Okay, they have given themselves some flexibility around that language as to how much either side of that they're going to be able to tolerate, but that does very much build the case now, that trend that I was talking about, supply and demand with, the overcapacity story that's playing out right now and not enough demand to absorb it, then we do need to see some stimulus. We know the PBOC's hands are tied, no change to the MLF rate this morning, so they expect that there's probably going to be more government bond issuance in the second half of the year. Guys, back to you in London.
Sam, fantastic summary of a lot that's going on, and I noted that weak credit demand story as well. There's a very thoughtful and long piece coming out of the Financial Times this morning, and I think it shines a light on what a lot of people are concerned about. And that is, the headline from this story is, can Xi keep a lid on China's mounting social strains? And I'll just go on one more line from it. The authorities are increasingly concerned about rises in unemployment, mental illness and crime linked to the economic slowdown. Everybody's always worried about the social consequences of the economy declining its growth rate too fast as well. But it seems that the story is getting more prevalence now. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think we continue to look to the third plenum for any clues as to what they're going to do about social welfare, because Chinese people need to feel better about their long-term income expectations. We've seen that people in the public sector, in government jobs, have had their salaries cut. We've seen this rise of nationalism in the state-owned enterprises as well. We've seen stories about that at the banks. We do get a sense, certainly if you look at some of the readouts from the Chinese state media as to what to expect from this big economic meeting this week, that we're going to see more of President Xi Jinping at the core, more of this so-called visible hand, and more of an emphasis definitely on these state-owned enterprises. And that very much opens the question as to how is that going to sit with the private sector? Because, we have seen they've lost their sort of animal spirit. And so I think we need to look at what they're going to come out with this week with regards to the hukou, household registration system, which has long limited those migrant workers, and also what they're going to say about healthcare and education.
Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market-moving news, you can head to CNBC.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabi Lekumete, weekdays on CNBC.